We're actually working in East Africa on a project on ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation. What is that, you might say? This is the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services, services that nature provides to help humans adapt to climate change. We're working in Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi and Uganda to try and build capacity amongst conservation organisations and the governments in order to implement such approaches and integrate it into their policies. Our 117 partners work on the ground in and around important bird areas, which are areas designated for their importance primarily for birds, but these areas contain a lot of ecosystem services, and the partners work with the people in and around those areas to use those resources more sustainably, hence our interest in adaptation.
Right. I'm interested in how the project evolved. Obviously, you started off trying to protect bird habitats, and what, simply too narrow a field, or is it, it wasn't enough just to focus specifically on that? How did it evolve?
We've always had an appreciation that livelihoods are fundamentally attached to natural resources. And we've worked on that for a long time. This particular project is funded by the UK government, the Darwin Initiative, which, like us, recognises this relationship between biodiversity, natural resources and livelihoods and poverty alleviation. And it is funding us to build stakeholder groups in order to discuss such approaches, to develop guidelines and to actually demonstrate at site level how these sort of approaches can work. And I'll unpack a little bit more about what I mean by ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation. So it means thinking about and valuing forests or watersheds for their water runoff regulation, which in the context of climate change is very important, because we may see increased intensity in the countries we're working in of extreme rainfall events. Another example would be to make sure that we're appropriately considering wetlands and their absorption capacity of floodwaters. Likewise, mangroves and the buffers that they can provide to things like storm surges, which again we may see a greater need to do in the context of climate change with increased intensity of storm events. And another example would be to conserve areas that contain wild variants of crops that we can then draw upon that have, when they have drought, flood and salt tolerances.
And what do you hope to achieve? What message do you bring to the conference here in Doha?
So the relevance of this work to the conference in Doha is that currently we're in the adaptation negotiations. We're discussing finance and other forms of support for national adaptation plans. So plans, mid to long-term adaptation plans, plans that aim to integrate adaptation across government, across ministries, across departments. And we've been working with the GEF to develop operational guidance for the LDCF, the Least Developed Countries Fund, which will be one of the mechanisms in which NAPS is supported. And we've been developing this operational guidance to help them with any ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation, projects that countries might like to incorporate into their national adaptation planning. Likewise, the Least Developed Countries Expert Group are developing technical guidance to support countries in the development of these NAPs. And we hope that through examples such as our project and examples that other organisations like ours are doing, that those guidelines will recognise the importance of thinking about the environmental side of things as well as the social and the economic in vulnerability assessments, which will then drive forward policies and activities associated with national adaptation plans. We also hope that there will be the appropriate recognition that some adaptation approaches can actually be harmful to the environment, and that's very important to think about, because things like dams, dikes, seawalls can actually lead to some forms of maladaptation, as we call it, so actually increasing vulnerability when they're supposed to be reducing it. Of course, these approaches are very necessary in some context, but we want that recognition to be appropriately incorporated into such guidelines. And then finally, I hope that through the types of work that we're doing and through these guidelines, parties will appreciate the positive and proactive role that ecosystems can play in supporting human adaptation.